Hi, everyone. Welcome to Food Talk Live. I'm Danny Nierenberg, your host. Happy International Women's Day, a day to celebrate the accomplishments of women, particularly in the food system around the globe. It's really a day to commemorate all the good work that's been done, especially over the last 15 months when women farmers, who make up about 43% of the global agricultural labor force, have been put into very difficult circumstances. So, honor those women farmers in your lives. Every Monday, Food Talk is interviewing business leaders from the food and agriculture sector. And today, I'm so excited to be talking to Gero Leson, who is the Vice President of Special Operations at Dr. Bronner's and the author of a new book, Honor Thy Label, Dr. Bronner's Unconventional Journey to a Clean, Green, and Ethical Supply Chain. I'm really honored to have put a blurb on the back of this book. It's one of the highlights of my career because I'm such a big fan of Dr. Bronner's. Gero has played a really important role in building Dr. Bronner's fair trade organic supply chain and establishing community projects around the world. He established Dr. Bronner's sister companies, Serendipol in Sri Lanka, Serende Cocoa in Samoa, and Serendi Palm in Ghana to supply organic and fair trade coconut oil and palm oil. Gero's work to restructure Dr. Bronner's supply chains resulted in the company and all of its main products becoming certified fair trade under the Fair for Life program in 2007. Gero also leads Dr. Bronner's special operations team, which helps educate farmers on regenerative agriculture techniques. Thanks so much for being here today, Gero, and congratulations on the book. It's really fantastic.
Thanks so much for having me, Danny. Really, really enjoy being here. This was one of my dreams to show up on your show.
You're very kind. You're very kind. Honor Thy Label is such a great book. Again, and it addresses a lot of different things. One of those things is this idea of constructive capitalism. And I'm wondering if you can, sort of break that down for our viewers and listeners. What is constructive capitalism?
Well, it's a term I think that old Emanuel Bronner conceived of early. It was codified a little later on, but it's pretty straightforward. And many people have talked about it, the concept of a triple bottom line. Mm-hmm. There's a lot of fluff that's being used. But when I look at how we operate, it comes down to the fact that we operate in a capitalist society. We better make profits, otherwise whatever we do isn't going to be sustainable in the strictest, in the most economic. And it means the decisions we make strategically in terms of production, in terms of hiring, simply and explicitly consider the impact on people in our supply chain. And that initially was, the people that work at our headquarters, at our operations in the United States, and later on, those people who work at our sister projects, but also the farmers that supply our raw materials. And just considering those. Now, considering doesn't sound like very specific, and that's what you have to do ultimately. You need to look at what exactly does this mean. So it doesn't mean just paying higher prices, paying better wages. What does it mean? So that's one consideration, and then the other is in whatever you do look at impact on the environment of your actions. And soap is a relatively simple and relatively clean material. The way we're making it, because it's made from agricultural material, that means you have to look at what are the conditions under which the agriculture does take place, and to consider that and look for opportunities to improve environment. And again, sounds super vague. The devil is in the detail, but this is ultimately, I'd say, what constructive capitalism does. And in addition to that, we're somewhat known as an activist company, and that means that we put a good chunk of our profits into philanthropy and activism. And it's more than regular companies do. We don't do this just as a fig leaf, right? We're really actually interested in the outcome of what we do. And if you would look at Dr. Bronner's website, you'd find out that we have a whole bunch of pet areas that we spend a lot of money on, and that's anything from animal welfare, drug policy reform. So it's a company that's concerned about using business as a force for social change. And of course, we think that socially, it's an improvement, right? We have no interest in making the world worse than it is. So it's really capital. It's just we play by the rules of capitalism, but we go beyond this notion that you always have to just maximize your profit. That is just boring to do. There's so much else you can do, and that's for me personally, that's been really the fun and the satisfaction of it, is to realize, given that there's some room for improvement on the planet, that actually as a medium-sized, privately owned, family-owned company, you can have an impact on that. That's been my kick for the last 15 plus years.
Absolutely. And it shows that you can do good and also make a profit. You don't have, it's not one or the other, that you can really combine those things.
It's not, and there's a lot of discussion. Everybody says, yes, you can do good and make money. It comes down to the details a little bit, and it depends on the structure. How do you distribute your profit in the company? Right? We have a crazy rule that not too many others have, which is cap your executive salaries at 5-1. And we're super profitable. There's no dividends paid out. So we're always left with a good chunk of extra profit, and that we invest in projects. And that, it does help ultimately our profitability too, because it helps, for instance, our growth. Right? We've been growing by some average 15% ever since I joined. Wow. So when I started, we had, I think, 28 employees. Now we're approaching 280, and the same on revenues. And apparently we seem to be doing something right in that you continue that growth. And we've ventured out into mainstream, used to just be, the natural foods sector. So apparently what we do is good for business, not directly necessarily, not directly, but it helps overall growth and expansion of the company, that we're generous and that we're credible in what we do, and we support things, right? So that's what I've learned the last 15 years. You need, a good line of credit with your banks. Otherwise, you can't do this as you grow as a entirely privately owned, no venture capital company. That seems to have worked out pretty well. So yes, this can be good for business if you look beyond just benefiting yourself. With something like soap, which it's just soap. It's not IT, just anything revolution. It's just soap the way it was made some 150 years ago.
Yeah, it's amazing. And I think there's some real big advantages to be privately owned, to being sort of family owned. I mean, a lot of you can do things that other companies can't.
This is one of the key things when people ask, well, can't everybody do this? It's really difficult to do this with publicly owned companies, because they have to follow this mandate of shareholder value. And shareholder value is in the eye of the beholder, and sometimes the lowest common denominator. And so we have a freedom. And I've come to really admire that Dr. Bronners can decide to do things which no other company in their right mind would try. Their venture capitalists would just jump, or the share of the price of the share would just drop. So we can do things that others can't. But there's many privately owned companies, or there's others where the shareholders would open to considering, but it's that freedom we have, which is stunning. It's that you just make decisions quickly. This is what I love most about the way we do business.
And I'm sure you can pivot. I mean, I'm sure you had to do a lot of pivoting because of the pandemic. You could make decisions quickly, help farmers who, were obviously struggling during the pandemic, do things that, again, these bigger companies with shareholders can't do.
It's so easy. This is one thing I like. Just not to bore you with stories from the pandemic, but we had a couple of situations at our projects. The first one was in India, where overnight, when Modi locked down all of India, there were some 4,000 of the farm workers that no longer were allowed to work in the fields.
Wow.
The farmers were allowed to. The farm workers are usually landless and don't have an awful lot of cash reserves. They had no food supplies. The welfare system in India really isn't all that good. And so there was an immediate need to feed people. We had our partners on the ground, they had trucks, and all I had to do is ask Mike and David for the initial $25,000, and this took 2 minutes to decide.
Right.
So that's how I like to make decisions, and this is what small companies can do.
Especially in a time of crisis. Again, it's amazing. And I mean, one of the things that I like, most about Dr. Bronners is that you're dispelling this myth that, you can only, that companies can only grow if they spend less on materials or, wages for employees. You're spending more on ingredients and materials and spending more on employees, and also growing, and, people are making fair wages, and, you're doing well, and the company's doing well.
It's tricky, and again, I learned this. Yes, we spend more on raw materials overall. We afford ourselves, let's say, on average, 30 to 40% on raw materials across all the raw materials we have compared to conventional. It's actually not so bad, and that's in part because we cut out middlemen for some of those raw materials. It's really important, though, is to look at efficiencies in the production process. And the one example I have is in Ghana, where we make palm oil. Now, it's designed as a traditional, rather labor-intensive process, and it employs some 250 people, and more than half are unskilled women. This was the concept, right? We wanted to give meaningful and well-paid, respectful work to women who had no alternatives otherwise. But you still need to make sure that the work is done efficiently. So what you cannot afford is to just have people just, hang around, or just have bottlenecked material flows, etc. So the trick is really to engage manual labor where it makes sense and where there's some respect that comes out of it, while at the same time being brutal to improve efficiency. That takes a while to get there. So it's not a contradiction. You have to do both ultimately, or you do need to limit the cost of materials. And it's not like I have to argue over the relatively high cost, but there's some things that are by design and you keep them, and others you just need to get over. And one is scaling. You want to achieve some economies of scale. Otherwise, you're always stuck at pretty high unit costs. So it depends on what it is. You treat it as a business, but you don't just look at minimizing the cost of your raw materials.
Right. I want to switch gears a little bit. When David Bronner spoke at our Food Tank Summit in San Diego a few years ago, I asked him, about being part of Emanuel Bronner, his grandfather's legacy, and sort of the responsibility that comes with that. But I imagine everyone who, you're not part of the Bronner family, but you have this immense responsibility because of that legacy.
It's that, and actually that's the same for, I'd say, everybody on our executive council. Now, this is a team of around 12 people. Those are department managers. Many we met through our engagement in industrial hemp hundreds of years ago, it seems. So industrial hemp is the plant that brought us together in different competences. And I'd say everybody on that team just subscribes to the vision. This is really how you get things like this done. Unless there's a very high level of motivation, it's tough to pursue such an agenda. It's very strenuous. You just work long hours, but you do that because you see that you're saving the planet. To joke, and it's true. You don't always feel that way, but much of the time you do. So it's just being part of an agenda that's meaningful, and it's funny. Agenda is diverse. The people are diverse too. Not everybody subscribes to the same objectives. There's arguments over certain expenditures, but there is this feeling, whoa, this is a company that can just kick ass, I'd say, and just makes a change. And that is among the biggest fun for many of us, and not just us. Just you get the feedback from others too. So it's that drive, I think, that you're part of a company, and that makes you super responsible and try to avoid failure as much as you can. So it's different than other companies I've seen.
Absolutely. And I feel like that translates to the consumer as well, because, as somebody who buys Dr. Bronner's products, I feel part of this kind of history of the company itself and all that it sort of entails. And, it's been a part of my life for so long now, as a Peace Corps volunteer. It's like every Peace Corps volunteer takes Dr. Bronner's with them because you can use it for anything. You can wash your clothes with it. You can wash your hair. It's like the most amazing product. So that really translates to consumers as well.
That's the other. It's not a trick, but I always joke. This is a trick. In my mind, this is the way to engage and convince consumers that you help them realize that what you say isn't just marketing fluff or propaganda.
Right.
It's true, and that's part of my job. Actually, I give quite a bit of talks. This was before even the book, and it's to just explain to people what you do on the ground. And if you start talking about dirty details, meaning you talk about agriculture, and soil, people realize that you are actually doing this, and it's different from just buying organic and fair trade ingredients, which many companies do, and which is great. But what we do is a little beyond that. We actually operate those projects. Those are ours. We make those materials. We don't just buy them. And that is a big difference that is lost on many people. But once they understand that really gets consumers excited. And I see it in the feedback and in the chats when you have presentations. And it's so rewarding for me. I don't deal with consumers usually, but it's so much fun to see how people respond to this.
Right.
I see the same in Germany, where we're growing and well present, and people long for this kind of meaning, and we seem to represent it well and credibly and authentically, and that is just much more effective than expensive advertising, which we don't. It's just a way to get the word out, and rather so we spend money on more raw materials. And I find this a fantastic way of marketing. I'm not a big fan of marketing. You always like politics. You always can't be exactly honest, right? And I don't like that. So it's just nice to talk about, the work in the jungle and how you get your hands dirty and all the trouble you have. And it's pretty convincing. I really enjoy that part.
And it really builds that loyalty. Consumers, again, feel really part of it. And the fact that you're not, you've mentioned the word fluff a couple of times, and it's like, this is not greenwashing. This is the real deal. This is really happening. And on these on the ground projects that you're, so deeply involved in, that you've, spearheaded, they're really helping people, and they're helping the environment.
And get that communicated, and some of it is technical. You need to keep it simple. So this is where our PR and our marketing department do a great job, and I work with them all the time. You need to make sure that message gets communicated, not in the fluffy way, that it's authentic, that it's factual. And so it's really nice to get the stories into marketing. Marketing wants stories, but I always say they better be true, and they need to be factual. And also you want consumers to understand, what exactly is it you're doing? What's the relevance of it? It's not so trivial, but it's less complicated than many people think. I enjoy that part too, is just to take our stories and communicate this to consumers.
Do you want to share one of those stories? I know you have a sister company in India that you've worked really closely with around implementing regenerative agriculture practices.
Mm-hmm. That's been such a long Indian story. It started in 2005 when we started buying. We were looking for somebody who could supply organic and Fair for Life certified mint oil. We had a supplier, and the first steps went well. We were ultimately receiving what we thought was organic and fair, and at least the fair trade part was there. Just over time, we realized it wasn't all that organic, right? So there's this fraud. There's in the organic system, there's commingling is one of the pieces of fraud. You don't always catch it immediately. So we did this. In the end, we shut down our own company because management wasn't what exactly we thought. But that process helped us just rise out of the ashes, so to speak, with 4 of the former staff who were farmer sons, but with an education, and we helped them build, we always joked, was a real organic project, because there's a lot of unreal project. And in that process, though, we discovered that maybe with tree crops, and this is maybe news to many viewers, with tree crops, you can get by to not use fertilizer and pesticides, herbicides. You will lose yields, but many farmers don't care. So you can get away with calling that organic, and it's called organic by neglect or default. You cannot do this with field crops. If you stop using, in particular, if you stop using mineral fertilizer, your yields will drop, and farmers just are not very interested in that because it just cuts their margin significantly. So you cannot ask people on lands with virtually no humus in it, which is the case in India. If you ask them to stop using fertilizer to become organic, you better make sure that there is a substitute. And you need to provide compost in some form. You need organically bound nutrients. And so after this fraud, we realized, I think we can't just tell people not to use fertilizer. And we got started, and this was the time when regenerative agriculture started becoming big or noticed here. So we set up for what's now almost 2,500 farmers on 8,000 acres.
Wow.
A huge compost operation that was German donor money that we received. And then we just set up a composting operation, and that's been grown substantially since 2016, 17 or so. So it's the whole package. It's providing compost. It's getting farmers to grow cover crops, even though they already grow 3 crops a year. It's an amazing place where you can grow 3 crops per year. You've got the sun. The soil, though, contains no organic matter, so you have to increase that ultimately. You also do that in order to increase water holding capacity, because the groundwater in India is just about as threatened as it is here in the Central Valley. The groundwater level drops, so you want to just increase the soil organic matter content in that soil to improve resilience, water holding capacity. So compost, having a rotation that includes cover crops, change your tillage, which used to be really deep. Farmers in India love just going through the fields 8 times a year with, pretty heavy plowing. So to change all that and gradually build up soil organic matter, this is what we kicked off. And it's a lot of fun to see that happen. It's not trivial. It costs some money to set up the composting operation, but that's, I'd say, smallholder field agriculture, regenerative. I wouldn't say it's best. There's many other great approaches to this, but that's part of our kick. And then at the same time, help farmers diversify their rotation. For us, they grow only mint for mint oil, but they better have 3 crops they can sell value added as organic. So we're going into business now that we didn't think we would, such as growing peanuts for a German company. We're growing tulsi and other herbs for an American and a German company. So it's diversification, all for higher value. And the project has just achieved growing recognition as just one of the effective and authentic projects that do smallholder regenerative field agriculture.
Gosh, if only so other companies could make that kind of investment in smallholders. I mean, the impact would be amazing on soil health, on combating the climate crisis, on on building equality and equity in the food system.
This is what we always think. If what we did would be done by others, and you mentioned the impact on greenhouse gas emissions. So of course we do. Carbon balancing, and it's an art more than a science to figure out what the emissions are. But you cut N2O emissions, nitrous oxide, vastly if you abandon mineral fertilizer, and at the same time you start building up carbon in the soil by throwing compost in there, and that cuts. I think right now we must be at 5,000, 6,000, 7,000 tons of CO2 equivalent a year. So that's just one way of dropping the greenhouse gas impact of agriculture. And then you look around and you think, well, there's a lot of big companies. How could they engage? And we're very clear why this is so difficult. In part, it's because of the decision-making process that we talked about before. The Bronners just say, yeah, I think we'll do that. You look at the numbers and figure out, can you afford it? There's no shareholders you have to argue with. So there's big companies who use mint oils or other ingredients grown in India, and they could do that. But then they also need to delegate people that oversee this work, and that's where the freedom, the autonomy the Bronners have given my team, it's just stunning. And I act in many respects as an entrepreneur, there's 3 companies that we own ourselves. There's another one that we control largely. And I have freedom that I could not imagine anybody at Unilever have.
Right.
Plus, they need much. The problem there is they need volumes.
Right.
And ours is such that we can actually say, well, we want our 150 tons of mint oil just from India. We're committed. We always make sure we have a backup, right? We're not dumb.
Sure.
And then it fits, whereas others may have 10,000 tons of demand and are relying on pretty complex supply chains. And then to have full insight into conditions on the ground is a challenge. So I feel with large companies for that reason. But there's to figure out. All we can do is tell people what we do. But I'm somewhat optimistic, is that what we do is, if you have an intelligent CEO, they at least start thinking about where in their supply chain can they at least get closer and do what we do. Not 100%, even 5 or 10 or 15 wouldn't be a bad start.
Sure. Well, and I think many companies and many CEOs are really realizing the urgency of these issues, right? And they understand if they don't sort of change, if they don't have more of a sort of mission-centric, ethos to their business, then they're not going to, survive. And survive, not just economically, but we have to start convincing these CEOs that their businesses depend on a healthy planet.
It's super interesting aspect, and I know you're in that business, right? You're doing that kind of education also for consumers, and my hope is that consumers in fact can exert enough pressure, serious pressure, that the CEO can't just deal with by just passing it all off to their marketing department and their PR, which is the common response. So we're looking for serious action, and I want to be optimistic then, because what else can you do? But it's really difficult, and there's that temptation is just to make up for a lack of substance with just excessive propaganda, and that's just the way it goes. But for us to set an example and to show is one of the things we want to do, and then hope people pick up and consumers say, "See, you can do it. Dr. Bronner does it. I know we're small, right?" But that gives us a little bit of arrogance and cockiness, and I think we'll continue this, and I hope we can just pinch and poke the CEOs of larger corporations a little bit in all friendliness, because I wouldn't want to work for a big company.
Right.
It's just really difficult to get stuff done.
It really is. Yeah. They need a little poking anyway.
They need some poking.
I want to go back to the book for a minute. This is the first book written about Dr. Bronner's and the company. And I'm wondering, what was the most surprising thing that you learned? You've been with the company for a long time, but while researching and writing the book, what was one of the most surprising things that you learned?
It's, most of what I wrote about, Dani, I already knew just from hands-on experience. I did spend, but that wasn't even for the book so much. I spent quite a bit of time getting closer into the history of the company. And since I'm German and have probably 2% Ashkenazi blood, 23andMe isn't quite sure. It didn't matter, but I'm German, and so I had a strong appreciation of the Jewish history and the tragedy of it. So exploring this and then also taking us back to our history has been super interesting, but also a lot of fun in it. For instance, we purchased the house where the first family production of soap started in 1858. And we bought that house and are going to convert it such that it can be used for a charitable organization that houses people with handicaps, but also brings the history. And so that was one of the experiences. But for the book, I guess I did some research, and it helped me link the history of the ingredients a little closer. So there's the cocoa that we grew, and I didn't know too much about its history, right? So all of these materials have a very deep history connected to us, and much of that history has rather dark spots. So slavery shows up in sugar, and in cocoa. And the coconuts are really funny because they migrated with humans from Asia down to Samoa ultimately. It's really, really interesting little bits and pieces. So I think it's the connectedness that in the process of writing the book struck me most. So it becomes this pretty big picture of a lot of crops, and they all have their history, and they all can be, and oil palm is a good example. They can be grown in a rather destructive fashion. So
Sure.
many people just think it's the crop of the devil. We say no, it's one of the greatest crops on the planet. It just depends on how you grow it. So it's that part to realize how all these crops have dark spots, and you can tackle them all. That what we do tackles those dark sides. It's social, it's ecological, and you can grow any crop. Probably any crop. I have to look it up, but I think most crops you can grow beneficially, socially, and ecologically. It just depends on how you do it, and then that takes us back to the constructive capitalism concept. It just depends on your intention, and you need to assess what the issues are in the supply chain, and that's what we've become pretty good at.
Right. What a great lesson, though. I mean, we were talking about other companies before. What a great lesson to learn. You can, you can either do this really poorly or really well, and have a lot of positive externalities that come from that. So I'm wondering, as you were writing, who were you thinking about reading it? Was it business leaders? Was it consumers of Dr. Bronner's products like me? Who did you really want to reach with this book?
Everybody. We had that discussion with Penguin first. So this is their imprint that does business books, and of course their target audience was to speak to business leaders. But we realized early on there is a whole lot of people that would love to know who's behind this crazy label, right? including yourself. And so I really thought about, I wouldn't say humanity, that's a little overdone, but it was really broad. And so my intention was not to fall into jargon or just address people with specific boring issues that have to do with management or whatnot, but rather I kept thinking about it more and more as it's a narrative textbook that can be read by almost anybody. So I avoided differential equations and just stuff that usually people don't care for, and tried to keep it narrative. And that's the response I get. It's really nice. I'm a scientist by training, and I just like explaining things. So this was, to me, a way to just explain some of these more tricky things, plants and humans alike. And so that audience was pretty big. I'm very curious who's going to buy and read the book. But I feel people's pulse, and it seems like I have an audience that is so far those people who've received early copies that respond to this, to keep it simple, reasonably well narrated, but also give some insight into somewhat complex connections across the globe, across the global economy in a way, including agriculture in the tropics.
Right. That interconnectedness, it really, helping folks understand that the products you buy at, whether it's your co-op or, a Safeway, that they really make an impact.
They do. And maybe, Danny, this is one of the things that I'd really like to point out. Why are we doing this, and why do we think other companies should try something similar? Is the recognition that if you're in business, you buy raw materials, notably if they're agricultural, you have an impact on a large number of people along that chain. And that doesn't stop at the container ship, but it goes all the way to the field. And that's really what we've learned in the process. You just deal with it. You deal with your workers and the farmers, and then everybody else in between. And what you do has an impact on their lives. And it's tangible. We have to spend money in order to improve things. You build a maternity ward. You help farmers improve soil fertility. Sure. So it's that engagement, the immediate experience of engagement and its impacts that ultimately drives us. It's not just to have a label, right? Nothing more boring than just putting an organic and fair label on a product. It's about having an impact that backs it up. And that, I think, is the experience we made. And the response my team is getting is, oh, this speaks to a lot of people. Companies too. Their companies are more careful. Consumers say, yeah, you guys are fantastic, keep doing it. Companies are a little more reserved when they speak about this, but I think
Sure.
it trickles in, because that idea that you use your supply chain to do good, not just take in donations and just put it somewhere and have somebody else do the work. Think that you do cool things along your supply chain. I think that does speak to humans across the spectrum, and that is, we realize this, and so we're ruthlessly exploiting this, right? We just want to get that idea out.
Yeah. No, it's fantastic. And I mean, it builds, it's not just helping Dr. Bronner's, right? It's helping farming communities. It's helping other companies. It's building that infrastructure that's really necessary to have regenerative agriculture, to have sustainable, economies in place to really help people, figure out how to, not just survive, but really thrive.
It's that, and it's the challenges you have in it, right? None of this is easy. It costs money. It produces a lot of sweat, and to also talk about the failures and the problems you have is part of it.
Right.
We're small. We're tiny, and if we want the world to just pay some attention to it, we need to speak, credibly about our experience, and then motivate and use what we do also as an example of how to implement things, and make people realize that farmers oftentimes initially have no real desire to go back to the way things were 50 years ago. So you have to change farmers. You have to provide motivation. Farmers are slow often in picking up new, old ideas, for instance, and all that needs to be clear, right? The enthusiasm that many of our industries share is great, but you need to balance it with a serious dose of realism about what it's going to take to do that, and none of this is easy, right? And Dr. Braun, this is the greatness of the company, is just to engage in something that's crazy for a medium-sized company, and then figure it out. So one of our jokes is, if we had known the kind of trouble we would be getting into when we started, we may not have done it. But that's the case with almost anything novel, right? You just start doing things, you have no idea, there will be trouble, but if you think about it too much, you're just not going to do it. And we did. This is what I so respect about the Bronner's family, is to take such risk, and they weren't even calculated risk. In the beginning, we didn't even know what we were getting into.
Sure.
And that I have the greatest respect for.
Well, and this goes back to what we were saying about privately owned family businesses. You have this ability to experiment and to make mistakes that a bigger company just, that wouldn't fly.
It's that this is the beauty of private ownership. And I sound like a capitalist, but that's what constructive. I used to be a communist. Now, this was long time ago. I just like private ownership if it's used responsibly.
Sure.
It's got a power that politics and NGOs just don't have. You still have to make money. That's almost trivial. Yeah, you better make some money, otherwise it's not going to work.
And I want to go back to what you were saying a little earlier about Dr. Bronner's is an activist company. So you engage in issues, like animal welfare you mentioned, or other kinds of campaigns. Other companies can't do that, and they don't have that ability to really vocalize their own opinions.
You mean privately or publicly owned?
Publicly owned companies don't really have the ability to do that in a lot of ways, but private ones can.
Private ones can. Public ones need a lot of consultants to tell them whether they're offending anybody in the process of doing it, for instance. No, it's most of it is politics, and it limits them. There are subsidiaries of some of the private companies that try to do this. So public companies are getting smart a little bit. So they at least have, subsidiaries that are now B Corps, which at least provides some transparency to the outside world. But public companies just cannot do that. That's where the power of medium-sized private companies really is. And it took me a while to learn this, and now I'll hopefully participate in the show until I die. It's honestly, this is as good as joining the Communist Party. It's much better. No, it's much better. No, it just gives you the recognition that you can actually contribute to a change without an awful lot of bureaucracy.
Sure.
And very effectively too. And while having very direct contacts with those you want to benefit. That's the greatest kick for us to, I used to be on the ground. This was until Corona hit.
Sure.
Last year. I travel half the time, and I think I'll go back to it, not quite as bad. You're on the ground a lot, so you have an appreciation of the impact of you do. And same with my teammates. And just that experience, you take it for granted after a while, but that's the experience you want. You just have to deal with issues and resolve it and hire people and invest in this and that and the other thing. And it's that experience, and it's difficult to communicate, but you can do that as a small radical company, activist
Absolutely.
company.
So many great lessons to learn from this book. I'm wondering, you mentioned Unilever earlier, and if you could talk to the CEO of Unilever, what sort of advice would you give them about, what they're doing?
That question does come up, and again, I've got just the fullest, well, at least understanding of the drivers of their business, and I'd say to at least consider some of your supply chains and then get real about where those materials come from. Pick a raw material that's particularly problematic, and maybe not all of it. Dr. Bronner is radical and wanted to eventually have all of our raw materials be organic and fair. That's almost impossible to do for a big company, but at the very least, look at a supply chain or part of it and try to do what we did, just to get the kind of experience. And some are doing this, but they're usually very cautious. And then also sometimes activists like ourselves may say, oh, you guys are just doing this for the optics. You just do it with a small part of your supply chain. I still believe that if you do this credibly and also don't make it look like you're doing 100%, I think engaging more on the ground to even understand what the issues are, it also gives you better arguments for why most of your palm oil still is RSPO certified, for instance, which is better than not certified at all. So I just like a more balanced approach. And there, I think just trying out and on some of your supply chains, get to the ground and then just be honest about what you do. That's a pretty high. Pretty high. That honesty is a little high as far as standard goes. But just try it out, talk about it, and see how you could use that in other parts of your business. It's impossible to do this across all the brands and all the products that big companies like Unilever do, but at least use a few and use that story and also put it in perspective.
Right.
And I know some companies do that. Chocolate, that's common, but it's always overrated, and they often lie.
Sure.
And that's what I mean. It's a misrepresentation out there. I'd hope that would go away and rather people focus on those things they actually do.
Absolutely. I just want to clarify, when you said RSPO certified, that's the Roundtable on Sustainable Palm Oil, for folks who don't know. I wonder, it's like asking you to, pick your favorite child, I guess, but do you have a favorite project that you've worked on over the years?
It's, I always think I have one now, but it changes over the time. So I spent total of 3-4 years, I think, in Sri Lanka to set things up, and I love the country a lot. I've hardly been there in recent years as we have a great management on the ground. The managers on the ground, maybe to make that clear, they're always locals, right? So the white guys, my team were 8. We support and make critical decisions and review finances and whatnot, but we're support. The day-to-day operation is done by people on the ground. And it's just changed as things emerged. So in Ghana is where we roll out dynamic agroforestry right now in a huge scale and diversify and to start bring cassava, for instance, into the mix. So it's the development of new product, at the same time build a Montessori school. So it just depends. All these projects go through phases, and I'd say all of the four major ones, including Pavitraman in India, they've been at times my favorite. And for a while that's been Samoa, where we buy or make and then get some of our coconut oil for the soap. because it's such a unique, small country, 2 islands with 180,000 people, and just a stunning setting, and with lots of need for improvement. Right now, you cannot go there because they completely blocked, don't let anybody in. So they all change, and it's like I said, over time, each project has been a favorite, and it depends so much on the development among the teams. To just see teams develop has been one of the greatest kick for the team, is to see that local managements develop through motivation. And they're not coined after Dr. Bronner's, but there's some of that spirit there, right? You want to take the concept we have, that you use a business to have an impact. Once you realize that people see that concept and consider this in the project, this is when you think, not you have it made, it's a constant challenge, but this is when you think, wow, this is great. You were able to set up a local business that follows our idea that there's more to business than money, than making money. And so all of them have. And I love all the places, but I'm bad. I fall in love with almost any place I go to if I spend some time there.
Me too. You know, we talked a little bit about this before, but what do you think it will take for companies that aren't like Dr. Bronner's to understand the urgency of taking on these issues and really making a difference? Will it take, I mean, we're going through a pandemic. I don't see a lot of big companies actually really changing. Will it take, the climate crisis becoming even worse? I wonder what it will take to, make companies change.
Boy, Danny, that's a tough question. I'm optimistic, but I'm also skeptical. I'm really not sure whether in my lifetime we'll see companies contributing their share to changing their way of sourcing raw materials, for instance, or just using energy. Now there is a couple of hopeful signs, and why is that? Because it's the shareholder value business, and the fact that companies just usually can't argue on philanthropy, but there's some interesting trends, and one is increased consideration of externalities in a business. Now, I've heard about this first when I came to UCLA in '86, and we had classes, and the professor was saying, well, maybe at some point externalities are being considered. So far, they haven't.
Right.
So are there going to be mechanisms to do that? Well, some of them, they have to be business. Otherwise, you have to be an activist like ourselves. And there is increasing indications that large companies have to start looking at the security of their raw material supplies, agriculture in particular, because there's climate change, there's social upheaval, and banks. And I know this from a good friend in Germany at Soil & More. He's been betting on this for a long time, is that there's increasing need among responsible companies to consider the impact they have through their sourcing on conditions on the ground, because it will affect the creditworthiness, for instance, and whether they're insurable.
Right.
So that's a nice driver to have for externalities to knock on the door and say, no, you better consider me. And that's something that shareholders can argue with too much. Now, it's going to take a while. I'm really not sure whether I'll see this happen, but there is I see light at the end of the tunnel, that there is going to be pressure. CEOs know that they should be doing this, but they usually talk their way out of it, right? They just come up with great ideas and great graphs. But there's interesting things, such as, I think, Nestle I watched, and whatever they do, they're looking now at becoming climate positive by 2030, maybe. So that involves mostly planting trees. And there's discussions about how wise is that, and what criteria do you use to decide what trees to plant? But it's the concept of sequestering CO2 and taking it into the trees. So even big companies are under pressure now to act. It's oftentimes not along their supply chain. Like we try, our difference is we try to plant trees in our supply chains that are more sustainable and can sequester, etc. That's tough for Nestle to do. But it's a first step. So you start seeing companies trying to offset their carbon footprint. Now, that's a good sign. And they do that oftentimes for for propaganda purposes, and they want to be seen as a responsible company, and that's all good. So there are a couple of trends that you just observe as you read companies' annual sustainability reports. And in the middle of the night, you sometimes think, are they real or is it just all nonsense? But you don't know. And eventually you'll hear, and half of it is nonsense. But there is action and people experiment. So I'm positive and I'm skeptical at the same time.
Sure.
And all we can do is just throw a couple of examples into the mix and hope that we can poke people and make them think about it. So there could be pressure, real pressure, to consider externalities, because otherwise you may not have the ingredients you need. That's number one. And then second, you eventually give in to public pressure, and you want to look good, and you try to become climate positive by 20 whatever, and then see how it goes, right? So there's a couple of trends in that direction. So I want to be optimistic, otherwise life no fun.
Right. We have to be optimistic. And you're right. Consumer pressure can make such a big difference. Before we wrap up, I want to make sure people know where to get the book. Can you let people know?
Oh, the usual suspects. I think it's on Amazon now. We had a pre-order facility at Dr. Bronner's through, I think it's called Spotlight, but just regular trade, you'll find it. But I know Barnes and Noble all pre-ordered a lot. I, of course, hope that smaller bookstores will do this too. And my wife and I here in Berkeley, we hand out books to the bookstores and poke them a little bit, but it's available on the big guys. It's available, no problem.
Great. Thank you so much. So my final question is, you've not been traveling like you normally do. You said you travel about half your time before. I wonder if there's a book or a podcast or a movie or something else that has inspired you during COVID and kind of kept you going.
Not really, to be honest, Dani. What kept me and my team going was that even though we couldn't visit at all, we maintained an amazingly constructive collaboration with all projects. Zoom was super helpful, even though connections sometimes really suck. But just to stay in touch, and we rolled out a bunch of significant projects. So what I found most inspiring is really how we managed to maintain human contact and collaboration in just the most unusual situation. That was my kick. Other than that, last year, no, it was more to recognize that people can connect in many different ways, and many people are screaming and shouting. And I'm glad I'm not a parent with kids at home, but it was just great to experience that humans can connect even through media in a meaningful way. If you're trained and if you know the people beforehand, that sure helps. So that's been really the experience, is that communication can prevail and that even affection is there, right? We've had many, it's just really funny to see how you watch somebody on Zoom, you know that person, and you just feel not quite as warm as you feel when you see them. But it does create a connection. That was, to me, the most stunning experience during Corona. But I think I've been stunned enough now, and so I'm longing to get back on the road.
Me too. You have no idea.
No, I can't.
This has been such a great conversation. I've learned so much, Gero. Thank you so much. A reminder that this episode will also be on our podcast, Food Talk with Dani Nierenberg. And next Monday, we'll be talking to Melanie Hall from Kashi. So join us at 4 p.m. next Monday to talk to Melanie. Thank you so much, Gero. Please stay safe and well. And I can't wait to read more of this book. It's so great.
Thanks for having me, Dani. This was an honor.